Hello and welcome to the top custom Hearthstone cards of the week. First up, we actually have a new keyword, Steady, where you get a bonus if it's held in your hand for X number of turns. So the first example they give is Friendly Fur, which is a 2-mana 1/3 neutral, where if you hold it in your hand for 4 turns, summons 2 copies of this minion. Just by itself, a 2-mana 1/3 isn't really that great, but if you're able to hold this in your hand for 4 turns, then you'll be able to get a total of 3 9 stats for 2 mana. Maybe it's not distributed super well, but still, it's about getting more value if you pay the cost of holding this card in your hand. And besides buffing the card, this could also just make the card more flexible. For example, Deathwing Jr., if you steady for 10 turns, it changes so that it costs 10 and destroys all other minions. It becomes its own little Deathwing without the stats or the whole discarding your entire hand. This card's more flexible because if you're playing against an aggro deck, you probably won't have 10 turns to get the steady, so you'll want to play it as a 5-mana 4/4. It's not great, but at least you'll have something to play. On the flip side, if you're playing a control matchup and you draw this card, you'll know that you're going to want to hold it for 10 turns so that you can use its powerful board clearing effect and get the most value from it. And there are other effects besides just stats, like Perched Bowman, where if you wait 3 turns, you get to target an enemy and deal 2 damage, as opposed to just it being random. Chained Lightning has an elemental effect that you actually don't want to get unless you already get the steady effect, where you overload your opponent instead of yourself. And then finally, there are steady cards that you actually don't really want to wait for them to activate. Time-sensitive material draws you 3 cards, but if it's in your hand for 1 turn, it's only going to draw you 1 instead. And Fresh Hot Bacon will restore 3 health to a minion, but if you wait 3 turns, it's also going to deal 4 damage to it. So objectively, drawing 3 cards is better than drawing 1, so you'd be incentivized to play this card right when you draw it. On the other hand, if your hand is already full or you're close to the end of your deck, maybe you don't actually want to draw 3 cards, so you can wait 1 turn for the steady to activate and only draw 1 instead. Likewise, Fresh Bacon, you can use it to heal your own minion for 3, or you can wait 3 turns and then use it to kill an enemy minion. So Steady is a super dynamic keyword that can change the effect and use of a lot of the cards based off of when the player chooses to actually play them. In the case of something like Deathwing Jr., I think it would be really hard to actually play that card. I think if you're going to make the player wait with a card in their hand for an extended amount of turns, then you really have to make the value worth it. It's a super interesting keyword, and it's definitely something I could see in the game. Next up is Crystalline Soul, 3-mana warlock spell that transforms a minion into an empty mana crystal for its owner. So for example, let's say your opponent has the Undertaker out on the board, you can cast this spell, it will transform the minion, which means it won't activate its death rattle, and your opponent will get another empty mana crystal. If they played the Undertaker on turn 8, then instead of having 9 mana crystals the next turn, they would have 10. So you are getting cheap removal from this card, but at the cost of ramping your opponent's mana. If you remember Blast Crystal, it actually did the opposite effect where it would destroy an enemy minion and it would take mana away from you. Now, while I do agree that giving your opponent a mana crystal is probably a little bit worse of an effect than taking it from yourself, I still think the 3 mana cost of this spell is a bit too overpowered. If you remember, on turn 10, you could play Blast Crystal and the spell basically didn't have a negative effect. And you probably would say that same thing about Crystalline Soul as well, because on turn 10, you wouldn't be able to give your opponent another mana crystal. But what if you actually could? What if on turn 10, you gave your opponent an empty mana crystal so that they would have 11 mana? I don't know if it would be a nightmare to code in, but it would be really cool if this card actually had a major negative effect past turn 10. I mean, the difference between having 11 mana crystals and 10 mana crystals each turn is pretty insane if the game goes on for a long time. And if you run 2 of these in your deck, you could get your opponent up to 12 mana crystals. With Lorewalker Cho, this would probably break the game. I don't know, maybe if this was the case, you could make the card even just 2 mana. I think it's a really powerful and unique effect that could be great for countering Death Rattle, but also make the game more interesting by giving your opponent ramp. Next up is Whispers of the Old Frogs, and if you don't know, this is a Whispers of the Old Gods pun. 6 mana legendary shaman spell that would shuffle an old frog into your deck. There are 4 old frogs. First one is Frog Saran, 10 mana 7/5, where at the end of your turn, it adds a hex to your hand with Echo that only costs 2. This is an amazing control card, where even if you only got this end of turn effect once, that 2 mana Hex Echo spell would allow you to transform 5 enemy minions in 1 turn. A pretty powerful spell. Then there's Fuzoto, which is a 10 mana 5/7 with the Battlecry. Summon 6 friendly minions that died this game. Give them +1 health and taunt. A very powerful effect and a Battlecry, so this plus Shudderwalk would be pretty insane. Then there's Cathode, which is a 10 mana 6/6 with the battlecry, shuffle 15 0/1 frogs with taunt into your opponent's deck. This would absolutely ruin your opponent's top decks in draw. They'd start to accumulate a bunch of 0/1 frogs with taunt, and it would be a pretty terrible experience for them. And last up, there's for Shorg, 10 mana 10/10. At the end of your turn, recruit a minion from your opponent's deck and transform it into a 0/1 frog with taunt. I'm not sure if it would recruit on your opponent's side or on your side, but either way, they're becoming a 0/1 frog with taunt. And so going back to this spell, it's a pretty interesting idea. It's a legendary spell, which means you can only play one, but Shaman does have a lot of ways of not only gaining random spells, but also they have cards that will be able to double this effect. Regardless, it's still pretty slow playing a 6 mana spell, and then have to wait in order to draw one of these 10 mana minions, and then play them to get some pretty good value. Now I think with these 4 different random choices, some are obviously better than others. The battle cries are a little bit better because you basically guarantee all the value, whereas the 2 at the end of turn cards, it's going to be a little bit harder for them to stay out on the board and get more value than just their first turn. I think it would be a super interesting card. I don't think it would actually be very good though. Again, it's a really slow effect where you have to pay 6 mana up front, and it's not like you could have a consistent game plan where you're trying to get a bunch of 0/1 frogs into your opponent's deck, or you're trying to get a super control deck with Frog Saran. You can't really synergize with any of these cards because you don't know which one you're going to get. But I think if you were ever in a meta where Shaman actually has a control deck and you're just trying to get more value than other control decks, then Whispers of the Old Frogs would be actually pretty good. But I think if it was printed in the game now, it would just be for some memes, and honestly, I think that would be a lot of fun. Next up, we have another card with a new type of keyword, Investment, which if this card costs more than the amount of mana you have, use all of your mana and reduce the card's cost by that amount of mana spent. Lifewing is a 20 mana 5/8 dragon priest legendary. With Investment, heal your hero to full health. So you get this Rena-like effect, but obviously it costs 20 mana. Using Investment, you'd be able to pay this 20 mana over time. So if you end your turn and you have 3 mana left over, you can play Lifewing. It will knock the price down by 3 to 17, and you'll have 0 mana left that turn. You can continue to do this over a different number of turns as an investment to get this card down to a playable mana cost. Maybe you choose to play this the first time on turn 10, spend 10 mana to cut it in half, and make it so that you can play it next turn. Now, looking at this card just on an individual level, I think this is way too powerful. Being able to fully heal your opponent is a pretty big deal. Cards like Reno and the Priest Quest require you to build an entire deck around that certain purpose. So I think just spending 20 mana in total to fully heal your hero is a bit too powerful. I think bumping this up to 30 or maybe even more would be a little bit better. I really like the idea of investment. It seems like a cool way for players to include cards that they can choose when they want to invest mana into it, when they can afford to invest mana into it, and how aggressive they want to be with the card. I think in terms of Lifewing though, the effect is a little bit too powerful for how cheap the cost actually is, so I'd love to see it a little bit more expensive. Up next is Navigator. Nice pun. 1 mana, 1/2 Hunter Beast. With the battle cry, look at the top 2 cards of your deck, put one on the top and the other on the bottom. This seems like a classic card game type of card. You take your top 2 cards, you're able to choose one, and now you know the next card that you're going to draw, as well as the last card you're going to draw in your deck. Perhaps you're running Tiny Fin and Deathwing in your deck, and you get to choose to have Tiny Fin next turn for some tempo, I guess, and then Deathwing as your last card to finish off the game. It's an interesting card, I like the pun, and I think being able to somehow know where certain cards are in your deck could be a really useful game mechanic where players know that they're not going to draw this one card until they get through their entire deck. It's simple, but I'd love to see something like this in the game. And last up is Project Chimaera, 6 mana 6/6 neutral legendary, where at the start of the game, if you have no spells in your deck, your minions' tribes become all. So this would basically make all of your minions have the Nightmare Amalgam effect. And this could get pretty crazy, because basically this means you could play any sort of elemental, mech, demon, murloc, dragon, beast, pirate, totem synergy, and it will most likely work if you have any minions in your hand, any out on the board, or you played one last turn. Usually the most powerful thing about tribe minions are their tribe synergies. So in the case of this deck, you're giving up really powerful cards and spells, but now you're able to get these synergies almost guaranteed. This really opens up the possibility for a lot of different cards. Duskbreaker, Gentle Megasaur, War Leader, Kalamos, Void Analyst. These are really strong cards that could make this deck amazing. And even some less popular synergies like Ozruk might actually be playable. It would be a really interesting sort of deck, and honestly, you could kind of go any direction with this. With Chimaera, you're sacrificing spells, which are really powerful in basically any class. But I think the reward would actually be worth it with all the different synergies in the game. And more importantly, I think it would provide a deck that is really interesting and would switch up the meta. That is all for the top custom Hearthstone cards of the week. If you want, you can check out some of the cutest cards I found on the custom Hearthstone Reddit. Thank you all for watching, and thank you to the card creators, and until next time, ta-ta.